Hello, I'm Anthony. I write and talk about video games on the internet. My aspiration is to explore them thoroughly and seriously as works of pop art, and to present what I'm doing in fashions that will help people learn how to better do so themselves. The project of mine which caught the attention of the host of this program was an experimental hybrid Let's Play and lecture series I made on YouTube for the famous video game Halo: Combat Evolved, created by Bungie Studios. I was invited here to talk about Halo itself, as I have come to understand and appreciate it, and to talk about making sense of art and culture in general in our present cultural landscape. I'm glad our host invited me on, I enjoyed our talk and found it valuable, and I hope you do too. Well, the video game science, yes, it's kind of a joke term, but also kind of deadly serious. It's this whole project to develop kind of conceptual tools with which to further deepen and develop our ability to appreciate video games as a serious art form, as individual works, and to better make sense of them all as a tradition we can actually meaningfully compare and contrast them not only with each other, but prior works of art and prior mediums of art. And that is kind of the bigger ambition of the project, which is conceptual language is at the heart of this, and specifically this idea of teaching people how to make sense of art on the internet. That is something that I am very passionate about. It's what I do with my time, and it's something that it's where I sink all of my time, but it's a place where I struggle to get a lot of satisfaction. And the video game science, if we want to be cute and call it that, this whole project I'm running across various different websites is trying to be the change I would like to see on the internet. I've spent a long time here and it wasn't gaining much momentum without me. So I've got the novel YouTube format kind of walking tour evolved let's play art criticism oriented project, and I write in various places, and between all of that, getting good feedback so far, the idea is to basically build a conceptual frame and a network of like-minded interested peers and fans, and together with all of this we can have really meaningful conversations about art which are going to actually develop and deepen our ability to appreciate art as a whole and deepen and enrich our understanding of individual things that we care about right now. That is why, of course, I started with Halo. It is a work which personally means a great deal to me, both for sentimental reasons in my own life history. It was one of the first video games that I seriously got into at a very young age, but even as an adult, it's something where with far more mature eyes, even 20 years later and so on, I look at it with, a perspective honed through years of the video games kind of fell off to me. I got into literature, I got into film. I've been trying my best to get in-depth discussions on all of these things out of the internet for years now, and I've been reading a history of criticism of things, of media that existed before video games. I've been studying film criticism, literary criticism. I've been listening to perspectives from artists, and with all of that loaded into my head, some people who are less with the times perhaps might say, oh, well, now that you're developing a real understanding of art, you'll put the video toys away. But no, actually, what I've found is the kind of conceptual tool set that you can build if you really try to understand art seriously and develop a very strong understanding of what you're looking at, and you have this rich desire to learn and the tools to actually follow up and do so. What I found is that this thing that was kind of with me all along, Halo Combat Evolved, if I try to look seriously at that, like deadly seriously, the same way that I would a kind of prestige art house film or a very like prestigious, religiously followed novel, just very rich in intention and meaning. What do you know? If you look at Halo Combat Evolved, the more mature you get, the better you are at reading art, the more there is, and there are whole dimensions to this thing, a universe of meaning. It is a very rich work which just kind of flew under the cultural radar all along. So, yes, Halo was one of my first big projects because it's a very good case study. It's a very charming and enjoyable work, rich, specifically good to talk about as an art piece and brilliant craftsmanship. It's a great example of what video games can do. It's wonderfully assembled, but it's also a richly expressive and intentional work where if you look at it top to bottom, and video games are actually lend themselves to careful exploration better than films even. A film, I can pause it and show you a frame. A video game, I can stop the whole action thing and just physically drag the camera onto the element that's of interest to me. If you really take the time to do that, you explore this thing thoroughly. You look into the production, you look into every element, every piece they printed on paper, every element they realized within the three-dimensional virtual game world, the movie sequences within it, the individual pieces of visual design. That's kind of something I borrow as well from cinema, just more conceptual language. Just think every piece of a video game has to be constructed. It's a virtual world in there. They are effectively practicing prop design, set design. Just think design, 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 which means intention, 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 construction, artifice, some kind of human will and human intelligence willed every last piece of this thing to be the way that it is. And what I have intended to do with the video game science on YouTube, more specifically, something that I think just comes so naturally, such a brilliant way to use the form, and so many people are almost getting it and then just neglecting everything right in front of them. The ability to play a game along with an audience can be very entertaining, but what if you were to kind of play along with an audience with a mind towards teaching them, a kind of guided tour? I'm your tour guide. This is a history lesson. We are treating the game as a museum of itself, and in doing so, I can just kind of use the thing as a tool to lecture about it. And as you've seen, if you've watched my many, many, many hours long series on the work, it is possible to talk for hours in this thing. It is rich in detail for those with eyes to see. So, what is the video game science? It is developing these eyes to see, this kind of this kind of broad conceptual literacy, to kind of borrow and doctor a term from Peter Greenaway, one of my great influences. It is developing this conceptual literacy and then applying it in a case study, which is, you know, not just any case study. For one, it's a very good piece of work, as I was just saying, but more importantly as well, I believe that analysis of this has been very, very neglected, and I'm basically taking a look at this game further than anybody has, even though it is absurdly famous.
There have been a million YouTube playthroughs of Halo
Yes.
Combat Evolved, but yours feels like the first to take it seriously. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's kind of the thing. It's Peter Greenaway talked about the ability to kind of see a film or a painting and not know how to read it. He says just because you have eyes does not mean you can see, kind of. He coined the term visual literacy in his lectures on art, where he says, you have to learn to think like a painter. You have to kind of know how an image is constructed to deconstruct it. And he is a man who can basically do what I do for Halo for an individual painting. If he shows you something like the Night Watch, that famous painting of all the Dutchmen outside at night, he could talk to you about that for hours and kind of put you in the mind of a painter and tell you how, like, every millimeter of canvas, deliberate detail, these things don't make themselves. If the whole thing is intentional, then that means that there is something to be said for every detail of it. No piece is arbitrary. He just thinks, oh, we'll just throw something down here. This thing is very big and it is very nice. The idea is that, yes, like there are people who, they think paintings, they've been told, like, oh, well, it's fancy, it's nice. I go to the museum and I look at the Night Watch and I think, oh, well, isn't that pretty? Like, yeah, you're looking at it, but a billion people who have only been taught to think like that, looking at the Night Watch, will not have the same insight that Peter Greenaway does because it's a difference of kind, not degree. Like, it doesn't matter how smart you are. Literacy is a skill that you either have or you do not. And I believe that basically, if you understand Greenaway, what he's saying, really, you can extrapolate that into general principles on art and take it with you, which is why his lectures are such a wonderful resource, which I recommend to everyone at VOs. He's a wonderful, entertaining man, and I think one of the greatest artists alive. But yes, why is my video different to everyone else's on Halo? And there are like millions of hours of videos of people playing through, or even more than that, getting on their soapbox and trying to lay out a thesis on Halo. And I believe that I went further than literally all of them. Like, at most, there were maybe a handful of people who I respect were on the right track and got a bit of the way along. It's kind of men in the room with the elephant, they're blindfolded, they feel a tail or an ear, and they can kind of start guessing at an outline from there. Most people, they aren't even in the same building, let alone the room. And I kind of found the blindfold and got it off and said, oh, elephant. You know, I can actually see the picture. I don't have to kind of guess with broken conceptual tools that I got from a high school English class or another fool on YouTube just kind of posturing, pretending he knows more than he does, or not even pretending to know anything and just kind of having fun with the thing on its superficial term. And I can't hold that against someone. If you think the Night Watch is just a very pretty painting, I can't get angry at the idea of you looking at it. Go right ahead. It's a public display piece. It's meant for that. But yes, if you're going to look seriously at this thing, if you aspire to look seriously, you should be open to suggestion. You should be open to follow up questions. You should be looking for people who know more than you. And yes, believe me, I looked around a lot, and it's something I was almost anxious about, this idea of, oh, I think I've kind of gotten kind of clever. I've kind of got one over everyone. I've made sense of this thing. And when I get this kind of theory, I kind of troll the internet neurotically, thinking, okay, surely I'm not the first one to notice. It can't be that desolate. And what do you know? It keeps happening. In Halo, I thought, okay, I'm literally the guy here. Nobody else has it. I have to go just blaze a path forward. The video game science needs me.
Yeah, and for our listeners who haven't watched your series, this is not what you think of when you think of a Let's Play series. This isn't you blazing through every level.
The big thing is just like you play a video game in the same way the audience just kind of pass through and ooh ah at the Night Watch. That's a painting, a famous painting, by the way. I hope you all at least knew that, but I'm willing to bear with you. We live in a not particularly cultured age. I can't hold any of that against you. But
Hmm.
yes, it's a very kind of crude cultural scene where I'm kind of completely reversing the spirit and polarity is the intention.
The standard Let's Play procedure is to sort of be a little child on Ritalin sprinting through the museum, and you are pacing. You are stopping to look at each painting, to talk about it, to think about it at length,
Yes,
and that is the way your playthrough goes.
it
Uh,
is.
you you might spend an entire video just in one area, sort of pacing around as Master Chief while you contemplate the world design. One of my favorite videos by you is the opening of the silent cartographer level, which you replay multiple times just to watch and comment on the dynamism of the AI if you don't
Yes.
interact with them.
I like your analogy of the child in the museum because it begs the very valid question, which I think frames very accurately what has kind of become of the internet's attempts to kind of create cultured spaces where if you don't have the skills or the training to make sense of paintings or fine works of art, like kind of begs a question which probably comes to minds of many people in these fine cultured public spaces, like what is the child meant to do in that space if they are just not mentally equipped to appreciate 99% of what's in front of them? You can't blame them for running is kind of a thing. And if you were to kind of demand like make like a school teacher and demand a cerebral response from someone you haven't taught properly. At best, you're going to get a kind of rote or imitative answer, which is, not actually uplifting him or helping him appreciate things. It's just kind of a strange cargo culting act which is being forced upon him. And that's kind of where we are at. What is the museum worth to someone who does not have eyes to see? I quite like this museum and child analogy you raised there.
Because the child has been miseducated.
Yeah, or simply not educated is the thing. And that's something we can get into as we go, that there is a naive side of culture which I can't hold anything against. If you just want to, like, Halo was made to be a fun piece of work. Bungie were brilliant craftsmen top to bottom. The thing can be appreciated on the level on which I enjoy it as a kind of like serious, moody art piece that you watch, like a Ridley Scott film, for example. A parallel I raised at one point is that it's quite thematically similar to Ridley Scott's 21st century science fiction, in particular the films Prometheus and Alien Covenant, which are, like many video games, far smarter than they were given credit for. The initial kind of gut reaction was negative based on a lack of kind of conventional wisdom, received meme ideas of what a prestigious thing is. But no, if you have eyes to see, it's a very deeply cerebral work which is trying to intellectually challenge you. And that is very much Halo as well. But at the same time, I respect Ridley Scott as a man who can, if you don't appreciate that, I think that Prometheus and Alien Covenant are still thrilling works, and he wants you to be able to enjoy it on that level, even if just alone. The same for all of his films. I believe that even the ones which are taken as more crass entertainment, like Gladiator, he is doing some interesting things with art history and tradition there, which that's another conversation, but very intelligent man who understands how to work from like the base of the entertainment pyramid, and like there's stuff there for finer minds, but he understands, like, the kids running through, they just want to see like a sword fight or something, and he can do that. And that's also credit we give to Bungie as artists. They understand that, like, yeah, it's a video game console. A lot of kids are going to receive this thing. And yeah, like the fine science fiction points and ideas we're working at here, that might be lost to a lot of people, but they can jump in the space jeep and like ramp this thing over hills, and we are going to make it the funnest space jeep in the history of video games.
And I think that where we're going to get eventually, and this might take us on a long and winding road, but that there is no ironic juxtaposition between the cerebral nature of Halo and the raw fun of it.
Yes, that is kind of the brilliance of Halo. It is not unique to it. It's kind of a natural point if you try to get meta with video games. You kind of inevitably have to address the nature of play and joy. And Halo, to its credit, was one of the first to do this. I don't know if it was the first, but it did it very well in a very complete way, which is also subtle. The works before it were a lot more on the nose. I still respect them a great deal. It was very ambitious and impressive works, like Metal Gear Solid, the first one. If you know, you know, we don't need to elaborate too much there. But Hideo Kojima had kind of logical conclusion, the idea of what can I say about what is being done with the inputs here? Like, how do I make a big picture story about human nature within a kind of virtual toy and have it not have there be no incongruence? That was a solved issue, but yes, as you kind of said, I've circuited around to this. Halo being a fun toy does not undermine its nature as serious science fiction. Bungie, they were very on top of their game. Bungie, the creators of the video game Halo, they were, in my opinion, some of the finest talent of this kind of like mixed tech nerd artist scene, the culture that video games were made in like the late 90s and early 2000s. They thought of all of this, and Halo is basically a big statement about humanity and the universe, tailored to be perfectly thematically congruous with the idea that this thing is packaged as a toy you control with a plastic gizmo in your hands, and you fly around in the space jeep, and it's simple enough for kids to understand. Which is
Yes,
no small feat. That is a
yeah.
lot of people, if you said, okay, you have to do what I just described, the thinking would be, how in the hell could that possibly happen? You want me to make a serious space jeep adventure? Bungie did that. Here I am, the man who, like, I can sit down in peace and have a brilliant time watching Peter Greenaway's entire filmography in a row, but I think Halo is like stunning, brilliant, serious, mature thing for adults as well. They did it. They completely won me over.
So let's talk about this. Let's build it from the ground up thematically. What is Halo about?
Halo is a very serious piece of science fiction, and to put it down to a sentence, Halo is a work about apotheosis, mankind pursuing divinity. And yes, the kind of clue is thematically in the name, Halo, rather like the ring around the angel's head. I said I might slip that line in. This is my kind of
This is your
Jonathan
Bowden.
Bowden. Yes, this is
Your
my
Bowden.
Jonathan Bowden speech of what Halo is. I won't do the voice, but if you know, you know. This is where we're going. Halo, the pursuit of apotheosis. It is the story of a war for existential survival in the future, a space age for humanity. We have colonized the stars and encountered alien life, and they are not these kind of clear sighted, spacefaring, scientific Mr. Spock aliens. They are, funnily enough, religious zealots, specifically a coalition of them, multiple alien races united under one banner, one religious prophecy. They call themselves the Covenant, and they believe that the ruins of another, now absent alien race are the clues that they need to perform a kind of ritual of faith which will allow them to achieve their own notion of apotheosis, which in their minds must be a kind of physical transcendence from this realm of existence, because the creators of all of these magnificent relics, which are how these kind of crude and simple minded aliens got into space, they found things rather than making them themselves. They believe that the people who made these things aren't present anymore because they achieved some kind of holy perfection which removed their physical bodies. And at the same time, they are being fought by humanity, who, if there is a kind of clear sighted, conventional science fiction civilization in Halo, it is humanity. They are kind of the Mr. Spock rational force who have the kind of attitudes that we associate, especially in 20th century science fiction, with the people who could be and should be potentially moving from star to star, building up across the entire universe. But where this is going, to tie it into everything I was saying before, apotheosis is the central theme. But once there is this giant religious faction, the Covenant, and as things develop more with them, you see that they are a kind of like tyrannical, dysfunctional empire of multiple different kind of incompatible cultures and peoples, the different amusing alien races who are all very colorful and kind of absurd looking. The impression you get is that this is kind of like a dysfunctional, medieval, mismatched army, like something out of like Central Europe, like some Austrian coalition army that speaks 25 different languages. They're kind of a mess, but because they found relics, they have space and they are maybe not the wisest or best suited for it. They have lasers and such. It's a very interesting aesthetic. And then humanity, they are in the kind of Mr. Spock mode. They are like the cold, rational people who, again, they are the kind of perfect picture of spacefaring masters of the universe. But they are on the back foot because the Covenant are massive and they just kind of have an unearned tech edge. But all is not lost for humanity. Humanity found its own edge, and this ties back into the theme of apotheosis. The Covenant are dysfunctional. They are kind of the archetypal picture of a dysfunctional empire and kind of bad, tyrannical religion, which is bad for the flourishing of human life. In terms of like spiritual needs and character, all of the aliens who compose the Covenant are basically human. This is an important point. They are intelligent, they are reasonable, they have roughly similar characters to humanity as well. Like they are capable of feeling like zeal, fear, doubt, greed, self interest. And basically, they are being jostled along by a very bad culture and a very bad religious system. And on humanity's side, on one side, there's a kind of clear minded scientific outlook, but to ensure its own survival, a character on humanity's side who is a kind of Hari Seldon esque figure. For those of you who don't know, that's not a video game reference. That is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series of novels. There is this character who is a kind of archetype who recurs afterwards in science fiction. But Isaac Asimov had this idea of Hari Seldon, a perfect genius who could effectively predict the future with the strength of his power to calculate and the depth of his insight into all forces in the universe, from human psychology to technology and the needs of civilization. And Hari Seldon is a man who predicted the downfall of civilization during a space golden age, effectively the Roman Empire. And the fall of the Roman Empire was Asimov's inspiration. And he thought, what would a man with perfect insight do? And well, humanity in the world of Halo had this Hari Seldon figure, a woman of perfect insight, who had this idea. She could see that humanity's space prospects were going to fracture under the weight of human disagreement and conflict, and she thought a civil war would destroy everything. Even though they were these kind of clear-minded Mr. Spock types, culture develops unevenly. Not everyone can kind of get with this clear-minded, best-for-everyone program. Things were going to fall apart just due to the human condition. And she recognized that this kind of like, what was at the moment the highest point of their culture was not enough. This idea of like, okay, we have the scientists and we have the kind of hard-minded, practical people with the gear and the training, but that isn't really enough to get you over the line, is it? She's the smartest woman alive, IQ of 250 or whatever. She can see that things are not going to work. Her name is Halsey, by the way, Diane Halsey. She is Bungie's Hari Seldon, effectively. And what she recognizes, it's very interesting. There is no scientific fix for what she is planning. She instead, rather like Hari Seldon, sees an answer in psychology. Specifically, she recognizes that she needs to create a new culture capable of holding humanity together and solving the problems of tomorrow. Hari Seldon creates the Foundation, while Diana Halsey creates the Spartan. She creates a new culture, or rather, you could say she reclaims, you could say, but we'll get into that. The idea is that she creates basically a space age manabund of new, scientifically augmented warrior aristocrats who, despite the extraordinary quality of their gear and the fact that they are kind of like genetically altered to kind of get the rush of like 100 generations of eugenics done within one lifetime with rather scary results. The idea is that she creates this kind of like distinct subspecies, but more importantly, subculture within humanity, which becomes known as the Spartan program. And this is where the human side of the theme of apotheosis comes out. If the Covenant are bad religion, what are the religious elements? Naturally, it figures that if the Covenant are a bad religious force, it's all in the name. The game is Halo. The enemy are the Covenant. It follows that humanity are practicing good religion, but where is their religion? There is no like pastor on board the human spaceships. There are no crosses or mosques or minarets. Who are these people and what do they believe? On the whole, it seems like they've kind of shed belief just for a kind of clear-minded practicality, but at the heart of that, they recognize something more will be needed, a kind of force they can channel and tap into. And they create this culture, and specifically the tradition through all of the names and thematic references. It's kind of on the front if you know what is going on. Spartan program, like, yes, the most ancient and highest ideal of warrior aristocracy, but it goes deeper than that with further references. As I believe I was saying to you recently, Spartan is the big one, but the Master Chief and his peers, they wear armor which is called Mjolnir, and the Chief is eventually guided by an artificial intelligence which is a clone of the mind of Dr. Halsey. The project which brings that clone into being is a clone of Dr. Halsey's brain, which is then sacrificed to create the artificial computer intelligence copy, which is, if you know your mythology, a scientific update of the origin of Diana, the Greek deity. She sprang fully formed from the mind of her progenitor, Zeus. She jumped out of his head, and the artificial intelligence which guides the Master Chief sprang fully formed from the mind of her progenitor. She effectively jumped out of the head of Dr. Halsey to be his guide. So she is on one level Diana, but on another level, her name is Cortana, which is a name from chivalric tradition, which is, I'm sorry if that was a bit too drawn out, but the idea here is ancient Greek warrior aristocrat, Viking, knight of a chivalric order. Are those incongruous in any way? They are different religions, different traditions, or are they? Of course, if you follow the kind of scholarship in a very up to date way, which since certain events in the 20th century we refer to as Indo European studies and culture, what's going on there is, of course, that actually they are one culture. It is one continuity of this kind of master culture of aristocrats who consider fighting from horseback and kind of the kinship with their peers and the excellence of their ability to fend for themselves and get where they want to be in life across all of the different incarnations. The Scandinavians who largely had to get by on boats because of where they ended up, the Greeks who eventually developed the phalanx, the knights who wore that rich armor and developed the feudal system and the kind of chivalric tradition which married the real underculture which defined who they were with the new Christianity of their surroundings. All of it is the one tradition. The idea that especially important is that it goes from like pagan to like paganness that exists alongside Christianity into Christianity suggests a unity which persists across time. And then the Master Chief being kind of, I'm sorry, I haven't even explained who that is, but the Spartan program, the idea that this future human subculture is a revival of a continuity which existed within humanity, a kind of ancient noble tradition which some people might not necessarily see as religious, they might see it as social and political, but no, I think it's actually rather essential to the premise of Halo that, yes, this is good religion to them, or at least, a religion of power, because as opposed to the kind of decrepit and dysfunctional ritual and blind faith-bound decrees of the Covenant, the faith which united these great aristocratic men of human history and is now the kind of core of this new human master military culture who are the most effective warriors in the universe now. They are the only match for the technological power of the Covenant. Is this idea of a kind of marriage of human purpose, human flourishing, and human destiny, which just creates this kind of unstoppable, clear minded joy in existence and ability to just find joy in pursuing purpose and living to overcome and fight another day. Like, none of it is a chore. It is it is the highest form of human existence. It is, again, if the Covenant are pursuing apotheosis, is the idea through a kind of this idea that the world is kind of aligned against them and they need to solve it. Humanity, the idea is that they have, in their own sense, kind of achieved a godliness through this kind of marriage of, well, not so much a marriage of, it's just this idea of harmonizing intentions, goal seeking, desires with, what we are at our base. The idea of rather than having to mold and manipulate people as the Covenant does, the humanity's greatest warriors are a product of pure cultivation. The idea is that rather than leaving their humanity behind or becoming like distorted machines or inhuman, the idea is that to create the ultimate human, you create superhumanity. You make them everything that they were meant to be and that they want to be, maximally possible limits. The idea is that the technology are augmenting what is already there and what they potentially could be on a long enough time frame. There is no manipulation against human nature, only the kind of highest achievement in its fulfillment. That is, to set things up on the base level, I'm sorry, but forgive me, audience, if that was a lot to take in. The game has not even started at this point. That is the backstory. Some of it through kind of the mixed media elements that Bungie released alongside the game, but most of it is, if not said within it, at least it is stuff that you can infer from it. It is a belief I am quite certain on that just from playing the first game, you can kind of infer about 80% of what I said, and the thematic intentions should be quite clear to those with eyes to see.
In other words, there is no ludonarrative dissonance in Halo.
Yes, you could say that yes, Halo is, to bring it home back around to the idea of like, okay, did I just describe like an entire science fiction novel to you, kind of? Well, yes, in the sense that they did write a novel, but all of that is just kind of vaguely implied within the game for which it is a setup for. And if you think about what I just said at the end there, what I tried to get at, this idea of they created this warrior culture to be the kind of tip of the spear for the human race, capable of doing things better than anyone else because they have this kind of perfect marriage of enculturation as a warrior people. They were raised basically with classical educations comparable to, like, perhaps you could call it something like what the British aristocracy used to get when they were being trained as officers to rule the world empire. This idea that you get your classics into you alongside a kind of deep appreciation for competition and the importance of just kind of asserting yourself and becoming individually as brilliant as you can be, this kind of cultivated tool for ends, but those ends are also your ends. You are an aristocrat. You are just meant to be better than everyone. The idea is that it does pay off, and you do lead a rich existence because of it. And this idea of duty and purpose and things to do not necessarily clash with what you are meant to be. It is the idea of classic manhood, that your life is going to be a lot of strife and challenge, but your life will be richer through this. And how does that play into a video game exactly? I'm sorry, but we can actually get to the game now. Halo, as
Yes.
I was saying all along, was a really brilliantly, fantastically realized piece of work. It is so much fun to play. It's like a Mario game. It is brilliantly considered as a tactile piece of work where, input, output, consistent, fun, robust reaction that follows a kind of natural logic. You shoot things and bullets ping off of stuff. Things that should explode, and explosions have this kind of exaggerated physicality where they pick up and toss things that are nearby and hurl smoke and clods of earth in all directions. It's just so much fun to just poke, prod, and play around with every part of this game. And you need to, because you, as the protagonist of this game, run into various dynamic combat scenarios which require some kind of elaborate thinking to get through. And it really is kind of this open-ended, joyful thing to play with. Like, I'm never rolling my eyes if I play Halo, like, oh god, another fight. It's like, oh, what's going to happen this time? What can I think of doing, and what will happen when I do it? It's kind of, again, it's this idea of what I was saying thematically, the idea of, a warrior aristocrat's life is this kind of, ideally, this kind of brilliant, constant brilliant overcoming, where, to borrow a line from Far Cry 2, a famous video game with meta ideas on violence, and I believe this game may have also been borrowing its line, the antagonist of Far Cry 2 introduces himself to you and says, living creatures exist to discharge their strength. Well, that's what Halo is. There's just, when you play this game, or at least when I do, I just become this kind of like wound up ball of anticipation and possibility and energy, at least in my mind. My body is inert and my hands are holding plastic, but as far as my mind is just engrossed in this world of Halo, I'm thinking, look at all of this possibility before me. I can do all of these potential different things. I can just throw myself into this. Is this really a problem in front of me? Yes, I suppose, but man, are we going to have fun just kind of going all in and seeing how we get to the other side of it. It's that idea, this kind of joy in overcoming, this unity of purpose and putting all of yourself into something. You are not bent out of shape. You are instead exerted in a fulfilling and satisfying fashion. You go all in and you get to experience this joy of overcoming. And again, that is the central idea of the novels written around this work, is that the Spartan program, far from being a kind of tragic fate, is a joyous thing to fall into. It's kind of, you aren't the unluckiest person in the world. You're luckiest if you got into this. The tools which were used to train them and the language they used to communicate, it all revolves around games, which is a kind of obvious meta play on thematically, it brings to mind how much fun they're having, but also it's a kind of meta conceptual play where, like, yeah, if you think about it, all of the key fighters in the Halo universe think of what they're doing as a game, and then what are you doing? And you can't call that inappropriate or psychopathic of the creators. Like, oh, they're lunatics who think that war is a game. Well, yes, so do the like 100 million gajillion people who bought the video game Halo with this guy with a gun on the cover. I think they knew what they were getting into. And they thought, if I buy this, I will be able to enjoy myself by being the guy with a gun. That's my idea of a good time.
And aesthetically, you have something you talk about is that the graphics, especially in the first and the second one, they're not a mistake or an approximation of what they're supposed to look like. And the remake isn't an improvement. This is a world
Yes,
of heft and brutal
yes.
simplicity.
It's very much a passion of mine, kind of talking about this particular era and standard of how things look. Earlier, I was talking about it as like construction, as in like it's almost like this issue of the painted word, the programmed word here, where like I'm emphasizing like, oh, just like think of the intention behind it, and just like the thing is just like an encoding of someone's ideas. Like, no, I think you should actually like take this thing as it looks. For one, it is quite beautiful, I think, to look at the ingenuity and just striking vision of the game's various designs and locales. Again, it's the prop work is brilliant. The character design, which is effectively like virtual costume making and casting and acting side by side, all of that is compelling to see. The kind of virtual locations, I enjoy all of it and think it is worth looking at on that level. But also, this generation of graphics where they could kind of render a virtual world well enough for you to recognize what it is, but not necessarily like one to one depict it. There was this necessary element of abstraction to it. Like it has to look like the idea of a thing rather than the thing itself. They can't replicate a human face. They will give you a kind of realistic mask, which will do these kind of formal gestures towards emotion, which, if you're willing to give them some slack and you are familiar with the tradition of video games of the time, you can recognize what they're going for. I believe I have even compared that before to a kind of theatrical form. Like, if you go to a no play, they aren't going to act like people. They are going to act like, received traditions of how to depict a person in a certain way. And if you don't get the tradition, it will look like gibberish. But if you do, you understand that that is, rather than a limitation, a kind of every limitation creates possibilities that they can play with. And if you do know that form, they can play off of that to satisfy expectations or even play against it to surprise you, or just it can be a challenge to harmonize these limitations within a more ambitious work. There is a lot you can do within a set of limitations, and Halo, I think, for a game which only has so many polygons available to depict very rich ideas, does an admirable job. And as you were kind of getting at it later in what you were just saying then, yes, it's also very much a strength of Halo, which is lost in a lot of later games, that when you are working with limited visual resources, it's very much easier to depict a world of what you see is what you get. Everything looks more three dimensional when its edges are clearly defined and interact in a clearly defined way with the edge of everything else in the world, because everything is big enough to collide in a realistic fashion. And something which happened very much next generation of graphics onward, which was quite tragic, was the detail which they could add visually did not scale with the detail which they could render physically. Physically, you are in a world of primitive blocks and circles and just kind of big geometric shapes and objects which interact as such. And then, kind of painted on top of them, is a more detailed hologram, but like you walk up to a guy's sleeve and like your sleeve will visually clip through. If you aren't a gamer, that means like the two ostensibly physical objects just kind of glide through each other like holograms. It is a very unsatisfying visual effect, which was just kind of accepted by everyone a generation after this. And I think that was something of a minor, if not major, disaster for video games. The better works try to avoid it, but as you scale up visual power, it becomes kind of an inevitable thing, unfortunately. Everything becomes this kind of holographic shadow world of things which phase through each other. And it very much undermines the idea that this is a world of, with its own internal logic, which is robust and can be interacted with in ways that will produce these satisfying organic results, which are so pleasing in old video games. It is a lot of old video games have this tactile appeal I talk about, and I believe it's a central element, something that they do well. It's why Mario 64 is the one that endures most strongly because it is the world of very hard geometric shapes, which, because they are running on the logic of geometric shapes underneath that, it is like one-to-one input fidelity. What you see is what you get, which is, I think, why it is so deeply satisfying to play. Nintendo are not stupid. They are artists. They are the finest craftsmen in the world, I believe, when it comes to these things. They are still aware of that and they try to work within the realm of tactility still. But when the expectations of visuals were more primitive, they could work more perfectly, I believe, fitting visual form to tactile game world form. And that created this brilliant result of a world which feels like it's physically there. Like you feel like you can reach out and touch things in Mario and they will actually, like everything will be a hard plastic shape, which is exactly what it looks like you're looking at. And Halo, the same applies. It feels like a world of physically constructed models. Like I understand that it's being rendered by a computer, but I can imagine like you plant this into 3D space, and if I reach out, my hand will like perfectly be able to feel the shape of every last like rock, tree, or the armor on a soldier, or the shape of an alien's gun. Everything is very one to one. Like you drop something in Halo and it bounces. You walk into someone in Halo and you don't like phase through their arm. You just kind of like stop short of them and bump against them. You push characters around and they bump off of them. You drive a car into an alien car and they like bounce correctly against each other with a big exaggerated crash sound effect and physics which are not one to one with those of Earth. But again, this is why I made a whole video about the physics, describing it as wuxia, by which I meant it is created for impression rather than as a model of reality within a game, which is to say, yes, physical tactility is about kind of making sense, but it's making sense to your mind, not about creating the world on a wire. You're like building the matrix inside a computer and like it has to be real. Like, no, it has to be organic reactions which are fun and make sense. And the kind of rule of contact is kind of a reality-based thing, but that's just because that's what our mind expects. Whereas, when the two space jeeps crash in Halo, what actually makes perfect sense in the realm of physics might not be what my mind expects and will get the most joy out of. If you make like a super exaggerated sound and they both kind of fly off with like 1/5 the gravity of Earth and they fly way further than they should, that will just be more tactile and more entertaining. And again, this ties into the idea of that Halo is meant to be fun to play, both because it is an experience of the joy of overcoming as a kind of sacred human pursuit that all of the highest cultures ultimately value their own, the joy of human flourishing as a high ideal. And this is about the rediscovery of that. The idea is that, yes, it has to be organic, it has to be reactive because that is fun. And yes, that is just a brilliant realization of that within games, not even getting into the thematic elements. It is something that all of the ostensible Halo clones failed to appreciate, and why none of them feel the same or are fun. Like people say Call of Duty and Halo, they're the same and they compete. Like, no, this logic is simply absent from Call of Duty virtually entirely. It is a kind of hollow world of ghosts and holograms and things which just kind of have a dull, unrealistic, mundane, and non-reactive, not very dynamic logic to them. But no, Halo is one of the most brilliant kind of reactive three-dimensional game systems ever made. And again, that does tie back thematically into the idea of the joy of overcoming, which is at the heart of things. To really portray that, you have to make the Master Chief's mission fun. You have to make it understand why it's a kind of blessed existence to be a Spartan. And I think that they passed with flying colors there. I'm sure you'd agree.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm just thinking now about this world of ghosts and holograms you talk about. It's sort of haunting your Let's Play series a little bit because you're playing on the Master Chief Collection, and
Ah, yes, yes, important.
one of the funniest and most enjoyable parts of that series is how you contrast the original with the updated graphics because you can switch between them with the
Yes, yes.
flick of a button. And
To explain
the
to listeners
yeah,
briefly, just I am playing an updated version of the game where they did a kind of pseudo remake project where they effectively painted new visuals with more advanced graphical technology on top of the bones of the original game, which is a very unique thing and a great opportunity for a critical eye in the arts. You can effectively see the same world as realized by two different teams of people working with what, if you kind of visually deconstruct what you're looking at, you can recognize that different sensibilities trying to portray the same idea create different things. And to bring it back to what you're saying, I'll let you take it now. Yes, that is a kind of central idea in my videos. They brilliantly, they did not intend this, I'm sure, but it's brilliant for me, gave you the ability to switch back and forth at the push of a button between the remade look of the work and the original one. And this is possibly like the best comparative art tool in the history of video games. It is another reason why Halo was kind of the natural choice for a case study. But yes, you were saying specifically about this element of physicality and ghosts and holograms.
well, there are boulders that aren't there. There
Yes.
are details in this updated game world that have no aesthetic or physical justification whatsoever. And at every point, it justifies your original theory of the intentionality of these early 2000s era graphics.
Yes. The idea is basically it was made for people who maybe wouldn't want to play Halo because it looks old. It's like in the same sense that people don't appreciate like a black and white movie, they don't understand that black and white can be interesting. It's a set of tools, just like color. One is not better or worse. More primitive and three-dimensional, like geometric shapes are a tool that Bungie were working with at the time, and they understood that it was a tool. They didn't just try to get as close to reality as they could and then like throw their hands up and quit. They thought, no, this is what we have to work with. And the whole thing is going to be built with that in mind. And this is, every last inch of this game is basically as we intend it to be. And then in the kind of crass minds of, I forget who they are, this team of people who were hired to do the remake. They had this notion of like, okay, we're going to fix it according to what's like cool and expected in 2012 or whenever they did this. And they just had this deranged notion of like more visual detail is good and just kind of like there should be more stuff in general. And they really didn't pay attention to or just didn't have high regard for the physical bones of the game, which are, by which I mean the kind of, it's hard to explain without being there, which is again why I didn't just talk about the game. I actually, if I if I'm playing it in front of you, I can physically demonstrate this within the game, just flip back and forth and show you that like, yes, if they think a tree should look a certain way and that way is like bigger, they will just paint a bigger tree onto what is still in the logic of the game, like the geometry and the collision data, which is a way of saying the physical thing that is there. They paint a bigger hologram of a tree on top of a smaller tree, which is actually there, which is shockingly disorienting if, say, like during a gunfight, you try to like take cover behind something and you think you are behind a tree where you won't get shot, and then projectiles are flying through this solid object which is in front of you because, you know, the visual logic and the physical logic of the game are discordant in this new version, and there is like a foot of extra width on this tree just sticking out from the side there, which is just, yeah, that's what you're standing behind, not the physical thing. It's
And
very, very silly.
this notion of refinement and simplicity versus over ornamentation and the Baroque is actually something you talk about within the series in a
Yes,
few different
yes.
contexts.
it's kind of, again, when I talk about intentionality and richness, things to appreciate, the it's not just like, oh, well, like look how nicely they constructed this door, this car, this gun. It's that if you actually think about like what it means that it looks that way, there is actually a very serious and thought out answer, because in addition to the like actual war being fought between humanity and aliens for survival, the kind of cultural clash between them, they have no debates on their philosophies or worldviews, but if you look at everything that they have built, you can see that everything they have made is an expression of who they are and what they are about. The aliens are a kind of, again, I said that they're like medievals with access to space age technology. So everything they make is kind of, I tie this into some old modernist art theory, specifically an essay I enjoyed by an Austrian named Adolf Loos, who was in the early 20th century a man who lived in a very dynamic region where parts of his country were still basically feudal with peasants around, and other parts were at the bleeding edge of culture and art and civilization. So he had a lot of this on his mind. If you look at what the space age medieval aliens have, everything they have, their guns, their vehicles, their random utility items that they drop off and scatter around wherever they're operating, everything has this kind of ornate, elaborate, ornamentational logic to its construction, where like they're kind of a simpler culture in the sense that they take joy in making simple things fancy in a way which we would, even today, like in the 21st century, we, even if you're not like a bleeding edge sophisticated person, you might think like, geez, guys, that's a bit much, that's a bit kitsch, isn't it? Like you've got decorations on everything, like all this elaborate line work and patterns and like strange incandescent coloring. Like everything for them looks like it could be in the inside of like their equivalent of a Renaissance church, like some insanely ornately elaborated old Italian construction. Like these people are like the Republic of Venice. If they had a flag, it would have like 25 colors on it and all of these different portraits and little icons and things all over it, representing every last thing that they are. And then on the other hand, like you have the kind of simple provincial hyper ornamentation of the Covenant. Compare that with, again, humanity are in their kind of Star Trek Mr. Spock phase where they've kind of grown up and they, it's not that they are like austere and they hate fun, it's more just that they've kind of grown beyond being the kind of people who would take pleasure in like decorative detail being on every last thing they have. Like no, their uniforms are like very drab and functional, like kind of earth and construction tones, like earth browns alongside like functional metal and concrete grays and gunmetal colors. And everything they've made is just a kind of like bleeding edge, kind of beautifully practical, kind of functional box. You know, the beauty in it is just how like you can so effortlessly deconstruct the logic of it, where it's like, yes, this machine is like pure, lean, mean purpose. It's like an F1 race car. Like it was just built to rocket ahead, and that's just every inch of it screams unified purpose. That is what is beautiful about the humanity in this vision of the future. As far as anything is, like you look at the aliens' guns in this game and their vehicles, and it's like they're trying to like imitate marine life or something, and they have these bizarre incandescent color schemes which are quite interesting and lively looking, but it's like, gee, these are some like really eccentric characters. Everything they design looks like this. And then like the human weapon you pick up, one of the first ones, the assault rifle, it looks sort of like the abandoned, I think it was a Belgian design, like the FN 2000. It's just a kind of big gray oblong shape that looks exactly like what it is. It's a giant hose that spews bullets and death out of the end. And you have to just kind of appreciate the vision that goes into that. It's like these people are not silly, they are not frivolous, they don't mess around, they have a job in mind and they do it. And thematically, that plays into the enigmatic third faction who are at work in Halo, which thematically ties it all together. I don't know if I got to this. The essential theme of apotheosis, how it is resolved through the plot of the game, you can kind of see it being hinted at all game with this kind of aesthetic and cultural battle which is happening in the background. It is ultimately one that you can tell that humanity has won or is on the side of the angels of if you're paying attention and you are really willing to take them seriously. The whole game is humanity and the aliens fighting over, well, humanity doesn't care, but the Covenant do. It is the legacy of the Forerunners, these missing aliens who designed everything which the aliens stole. They aren't members of the Covenant, they're some missing third party here. And you're like fighting in and around Forerunner ruins, sorry, and the aliens, they don't really get this. It's not of them, but they worship it. They think whoever made this must have been so brilliant as to be divine. And you look at all of these Forerunner structures, and what do you see? You don't see like strange purple and shimmering rainbow incandescent curves and sweeping ornamentations and busy natural organic details. You see hard, practical, purpose-oriented shapes, very drab, muted colors. Everything is just like, yeah, what's your favorite shade of concrete? Whoever the Forerunners were, they were these people who had this like very kind of titanic distance from whatever it is that the Covenant are and enjoy. They were people who just, they took pleasure in purity of form, perfection of function, and perhaps you can kind of see the great twist which is coming. The Forerunners, this foresighted, brilliant race who were at one point the masters of the universe, who are their natural heirs? Who is it who, just by being themselves and doing what they were planning to do anyway, without any plan of worship or fulfillment of prophecy or fulfillment of ritual, just completely being themselves, there is someone in the universe of Halo who are about halfway to resembling Forerunners without even knowing what they are? The answer, of course, where the plot of Halo goes, is humanity discovering that this absent third party who the Covenant have been worshipping all this time are actually the ancient ancestors of the human race before they lost their spacefaring capacity. Humanity had already settled the universe, already built up to a titanic, perfect level of civilization, and then lost it all and started back again at zero. And again, their nature never changed. Given the chance to build up again, they are already in the process of becoming the Forerunners. And that's kind of on the other hand, the tragedy of the Covenant's existence, which is explored more in Halo 2, this idea that, they worship something which is fundamentally not them, and to kind of keep the picture together, their leaders have to lie to and manipulate them, and their whole idea of the divine and the point of their existence is just kind of torturing themselves to become a kind of cargo cult imitation of something which is not them, and which they, as much as they are human, like their destiny is probably ultimately something a bit different, and they have to basically stop fetishizing and misunderstanding and making an idol of humanity and become their own people if they want to have a dignified and complete existence. The path to apotheosis is, according to kind of the old tradition, which is kind of revived and reclaimed within Halo, it is in ultimately kind of being yourself and achieving this kind of joyous fulfillment of your own nature, which is what the protagonist of Halo, the leader of the Spartan program from among its candidates, the Master Chief, a kind of primal Indo-European warband leader name, which is a real military rank, of course, but I think that's kind of a joke within Bungie that he has such a like fierce and primal title. He is at the forefront of this whole kind of like underlying religious experience, and you could say the holiest being in the universe. In the logic of the Covenant, all humanity are holy because in their warped understanding they built the things they consider relics, but they are also holy because they achieved the most perfect and brilliant existence, and they did that by learning entirely to be themselves and mastering and fulfilling their own nature. And the most self-mastered and fulfilled man alive is the Master Chief, so he is kind of the one who is closest to godliness in all of this, and that kind of comes out in the aesthetic, that it is a story of humanity becoming, and specifically like becoming what they always were all along, which mirrors back the idea of the Spartan program and reclaiming an ancient culture, which was, we had this and then we lost it and then we revived it. And that is thematically echoed in the idea of the Forerunners. The Forerunners are space Indo-Europeans, to put it bluntly. And it is a
Yes,
story of humanity rediscovering that, like, okay, at our heart, this is what we are, and this is when we were at our most glorious and most fulfilled.
that's beautifully put. Beautifully put. And of course, we have another perfect dovetailing of theme and the science fictional framework of all of this and gameplay because you, as Master Chief, are the holiest of these holy beings because you are the animating intelligence. You are the human intelligence that the entire game world is revolving around.
Yes,
You are
you
the
are the
player
one.
character.
You are the one exercising the most agency. You are, frankly, the one having the most fun. Like, your increased killing power is, in a more general and abstract sense, a greater power to leverage yourself against your circumstances. You can really go all in and make the difference here, which is what makes existence fun and satisfying. Again, to quote our friend the Jackal, living beings exist to discharge their strength. Logically, the more strength you have and the more of it you're able to satisfyingly exercise in the pursuit of getting what you want, then the more fully you are living. And that is the Master Chief. He is 100 times more potent than everyone around him, and he is able to discharge every last ounce of that in the pursuit of getting things done. And that is a blessed existence, if anything is.
Absolutely. And then the final irony here with the this discussion of the Covenant and their aesthetic sensibilities is, of course, when we're talking about the Covenant, we're also talking about 343 Studios.
Yes, it is very funny and very, very tragic what ultimately happened to this series that I love so much, Halo. Bungie, this poor old stock, ultra dedicated team, they worked themselves almost to death during the 2000s, making a brilliantly successful run of games, several of which I consider to have been like completely and perfectly realized works, even if towards the end they were under the pump, the team gets bigger, the vision gets a bit diluted, it has to respond to the cultural forces around them, and just that Halo is so big it can't be any small group of people's thing. It really just becomes a larger than life force. And then after a certain point, they kept having to shelve projects other than Halo. They were a bit tired, they were a bit done. Bill Gates owns Halo. That was the deal they made when he bought them. When he bought them, after their last game had a difficult financial run because of a bug which actually forced them to recall it to protect people's computers. They made the deal with Microsoft, who would bankroll their next game, which was Halo. And the kind of deal they had going was Bill Gates says, "You guys make whatever you want, and you're like supported by me, but I will own Halo." And what eventually happens is they decide, we're done with Halo. We're not going to work in the Halo mines anymore. We've set our piece. It's a complete vision. Bill says, okay, you guys do what you want. That's super. But Halo will never die. And he takes a few of the eager beavers from Halo's original team or existing team. Many of the key ones were latecomers who maybe disagreed with a few of the old core members about what Halo was and were eager to kind of get their hands on the levers and exercise some control finally. And you pair that with a bunch of like newcomers scraped in from what the video game industry has become since, and it's become a lot more open. There is a lot more power and prestige up for grab. You get a lot of like less passionate and more kind of devious and or simple-minded and common people. And suddenly the team making Halo is now, instead of this kind of clear-minded, united, autism manabund of American tech guys with their feet in like what's left of the tradition of the classics alongside, you know, popular culture and tech culture. They're this brilliant like force, exactly the kind of guys you want doing like interactive multimedia science fiction. Where now instead this kind of weird cosmopolitan imperial amalgamation of people scraped up from the new changing face of the industry. There are like all of these people you've never heard of in key creative positions, and they have ideas which kind of make you, if you listen to the interviews for when Halo 4 is coming up, you kind of think, ooh, gee, who is this? Do they know what they're talking about? And to make a long story short, what you were getting at, we could have been far more pithy with this perhaps, is yes, what ultimately happened was this kind of great relic left behind by a higher culture fell into the hands of the unworthy, and they kind of made an idol of it and mutilated it in their own image and called it the purest successor to the real thing. And yeah, they understood Halo about as well as the unfortunate Covenant understood the Forerunners, and the result, unfortunately, is that they were able to pull off their attempt at apotheosis, and that was Halo 4, which I actually only played recently for the first time on my channel. And gee, if you want some like raw human response to, art playing out in real time, you watch me play that game, I'm not having a good time. I actually had to literally censor things that I was saying at one point just so I wouldn't get thrown off YouTube.
Uh,
It was yes, it's very funny and very tragic that it mirrors the lore of Halo. It is about kind of the glorious tradition of human flourishing and their great works falling into the hands of the kind of those who are not ready and perhaps not even just kind of constitutionally suited and making a mess of it. And yeah, what is the successor studio to Bungie, 343 Studios, but basically exactly that happening again. It is this great work by people who were in their prime, just full of brilliance and purpose. They made this great thing, and then these newcomers find it and they just kind of pick it up and think, hey, great, we get this. This is about me. And oh no, the results were. You can just see again, it's like hitting the visual overhaul button in Halo Combat Evolved, but 1,000 times worse. You can, if you want to see what different sensibilities handling the same idea looks like, Halo Combat Evolved, rich in purpose. If you think about it, you can see a good, intelligent idea behind every inch of its construction. Halo 4, if you try to think about it, you can just see this kind of like cliche ridden idiocy and just obliviousness to any notions of the possibility of meaning, just minds dominated by cliches and received forms which are not understood, just arbitrary changes made for the selfish sake of having a personal impact regardless of how it shapes the work. Just if you try to mentally deconstruct Halo 4 while playing it and you try to like identify the intelligence behind the decisions made which ultimately form its final shape, you will only be able to conclude like these people are so far from Bungie and they are so far from the spirit of Bungie. They didn't understand, they didn't want to understand. Their instincts are the polar opposite. It is just incredible. As I was saying in the thing, it is in my playthrough of Halo 4 when I was seeing it for the first time. The comparison that kept coming to my mind is this is what happened to Star Wars when George Lucas left. This is the Star Wars sequel trilogy, but video games.
yeah, I mean, it's what happens when the creators give way to the fans, where you have the original people, they're not thinking about Halo when they're making Halo because they have their own set of references. And now you have the new writers coming in, and they're essentially doing a more prestigious version of like PG rated John X Cortana fan fiction.
It is I kind of want to say when you say fan, I kind of want to bring it back to the analogy you made earlier of the kid in the museum. There might be a kid who, like, because of superficial details, they all have weapons or something, decides, like, yeah, I'm a big fan of the Night Watch. I like it because it's a painting of so many guys with weapons. And then, he gets put in charge of commissioning the Night Watch 2. What's going to happen then? It's just going to be like the
Bigger
cover
weapons.
illustration.
Yeah.
It's going to be the cover illustration of like a Warhammer 40k novel, basically. That's what's going to happen. And the creative leads on Halo 4, I think good work by someone other than me was done. There's this guy who calls himself something like Sabretooth on YouTube who did a good video on this. Frank O'Connor is the Bungie holdover, a latecomer who was kind of the creative lead on Halo 4. I think if you look at the things he has to say and like what he thought was a good idea to do with Halo, he is that kid in the museum. He looked at the Night Watch and thought, yeah, this is a great painting about weapons. I'm going to make the second one and it'll be great. That is basically like how we saw Halo. He looked at it and he saw a few superficial details and just thought like, I love the Master Chief. He kills Allens and doesn't afraid of anything. It's really cool that John Halo and his girlfriend Cortana survived the events of Halo 3. I'm gonna give them another adventure. Oh dear, it's yes, different sensibilities, people not getting it. Again, I really like it's very good that that kind of came out spontaneously right as we were starting. That analogy of the kid in the museum appreciating things as far as he's able. Like you say fan, that doesn't have to be a dirty word, but the kind of connotation there or denotation, I forget which is which. I'm willing to be honest about that. The kind of meaning we imply when we say fan in the negative sense is someone who maybe likes something a lot, but does not necessarily appreciate it richly or in a way which we should admire or think is worth much. Like hating someone for liking something is just a dick move, but considering it kind of absurd that someone just kind of has like a very cultivates and makes a big deal out of what is ultimately a very shallow fascination with something, that is something we should maybe at least like look down on. But the nice way of saying it would be like, hey, bro, if you like Halo, have you heard of this guy named Anthony? Maybe he can help you like Halo even more.
Exactly.
But yes,
Which,
in the sense
which,
of like,
by the way, the link to your YouTube series is in the description.
excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
And while we're at it, could you also link like the backlogged account just because I'm very
Oh yeah.
passionate about the writing
Oh
I
yeah.
have there?
Oh yeah.
And we could get that could be a kind of segue in a moment, if you'd like, into speaking more
Yes.
generally about the industry, and what I consider kind of the necessary corrective measures made if you want to cast a critical eye upon the industry in general. But just
Yes.
to
That
conclude that
sounds
last
wonderful.
thought where you
Yeah.
said fans, this idea that yes, the idea of putting fans in charge, like there are fans and fans, like technically you could call me like Halo's biggest fan, but you maybe instinctively wouldn't. You would call me like a critic looking at it or something. But yes, the kind of if you really want to get if you want to kind of sharpen your understanding of like looking at the state of culture and with how things work on the internet, which is for better and worse where culture happens now, like there is this kind of vague growing awareness that fans and even now we have this new abominable term fandom, which I think basically means get self-declared gathering of fans. That's what it's come to mean. Being a fan, like in the sense of just enjoying something, is not something to look down upon. Perhaps I'm repeating myself here, but I consider this important. If there is something wrong with being a fan, it is making a big deal out of what is ultimately like a shallow interest. Like you make a lot out of being a fan, but like you don't appreciate the thing. It's just kind of a, again, it's like a totem to you or a fetish. It's like what the Forerunners are to the Covenant, or ultimately, tragically, what Halo was to 343. That is the downside of being a fan. But if someone who is a very rich appreciator of something decides to follow up, that is perfectly fine. If Werner Herzog wants to make a Nosferatu movie because he says, I am a big fan, it means a lot to me. You know, he
Yeah.
makes his own Nosferatu film. The result is not like a fandom piece of culture. The result is something very rich because he is a he is a man with a critical eye. He has a rich appreciation of anything which he looks at. And I believe I haven't seen it yet, but Robert Eggers, a man who I still haven't seen any of his films, but he seems to be a serious artist. He made a Nosferatu film as well, and I think it is safe to say that he does not have this kind of puerile fan fascination if he felt the need to kind of contribute this to this ongoing tradition within cinema. I imagine that he had something far richer to express, so we do not call him a fan in the derogatory way, I imagine.
So now that we've talked about Halo, and
Yes.
I started out by asking you, what is a video game science? Now, what is culture terror?
Culture terror, yes, I've started saying that recently in relation to a few things. The way to lead into this, I think, is I mentioned briefly that I made an account on Backlogged, which is like Letterboxd for video games. And if you don't even know what Letterboxd is, that's basically a cataloging site where you make an account and mark every piece of media that you've like, every movie you've seen or every game you've played. And there's a feature where you can write reviews. And I saw on Backlog that it was like not at all a sophisticated culture. Like no one was even aspiring to really be serious. And almost as a joke, I just thought, what if I just showed up there and tried to write like the most bleeding edge analysis possible of things that I care about. I don't care if a single person reads these. It can just be an archive of my thoughts and I'll share it. It will be an archive of my thoughts and I will just share it with my friends. And it's been a very interesting experience. I have written several things, and rather amusingly, the regular user base of Backlogged have actually found me a few times. I'm kind of Colonel Kurtz among the kind of dark, among the kind of heart of darkness of culture. These people who are just like, they've never attempted a serious thought about anything before. They're kind of bewildered by my presence, but I do get noticed a bit there. I've written a lot, and what I do there is I don't just like dump like dot points of what I think of something. I try to write something that really lays out what I make of something, what it means specifically to me, the like most distinct impression I got or whatever. What I try to do is I try to lay out this complete kind of, you can follow it from zero, assuming you are basically at zero. I construct all of the supporting arguments and infrastructure, the whole story needed to see the thing as I do. And I raise this point actually in several of my reviews. Like at some point, 3/4 in, I have to say, like, sorry about all the meta talk and talking around the thing, but this is where the action is. This is like a work with a grand social reception. So to talk about what I make of it, I have to address the cultural landscape. And that gets back to the question you asked me, what is culture terror? Culture terror is the reason why, when talking about something that's of any interest to me, if I'm assuming that the audience don't know me and how I think, and they aren't like just going to like start familiar with where I'm going to go, it's why if I'm intending to start at zero, I have to write a like page long minimum preamble explaining how I even got to like the beginning of how I'm looking at this thing, because what I have to do is explain how the thing is currently seen, give like the brief history of that, and explain why it is wrong and how it came to be wrong and why they've never found someone thinking about it like me before. And then I can just go into saying, like, so when I looked at this thing, what I made of it was I liked this, I thought it was doing this, I found this charming, it was drawing upon this to do that, and I quite liked it. It was, all of the things I would just say from scratch to someone who I know. Like, if you asked me, hey, Anthony, what do you think of so and so? I would just start talking like that. But yes, the average person, the kind of cultural water that we're swimming in is not good. We are living under the culture terror, which means that if you want to get a clear understanding of anything, get a good understanding, you have to recognize what has happened to the world around us and, have that inform your understanding. You need to understand where we're at, and that is the baseline from which you understand everything as a product of this cultural landscape. And what is this cultural landscape post-terror? Well, I believe that there are two parts of it, which I believe I was setting this up earlier. I explained this at least briefly before. Sorry, that's pointless to say. Two parts of it. The clear cut, the kind of great severance of history, the history of art and the history of culture in general. People do not know, frankly, like an almost disturbing amount of what humanity has done before our own time. And more than that, they do not appreciate it. They force you to scan your eyes across the pages of a few Shakespeare plays in high school, maybe if you're fortunate. Do they even do that anymore? I don't know. But, is anyone really enlightened or enriched by that? Do they have they really like reached out to and met a mind of another century and really broadened their understanding of what humanity is? And especially through contact with a mind that lived several hundred years before their own, kind of developed an appreciation for a kind of coarser and more grounded human experience. Obviously, you look at the world around us, no one can imagine the like grounded, serious judgment of someone who was like living on the ground during the very like necessarily hard and simple and immediate experience of life in pretty much any century before the 20th. I even think the 19th is frankly just beyond people half of the 20th as well. It's a bit of a disaster. When I say cultural clear cut, I don't just mean like oh, well, it's sad to me that people haven't seen all of my favorite movies from the 70s or my favorite novels from the early 20th century. It's like, it's that more than that, they couldn't understand the sentiments that informed and constructed them. They couldn't, like, they don't have it in them to, like, understand the mind that wrote these novels from the early 20th century, even, like, as a fellow human being. If they try to, like, reach out and touch that consciousness, which is just as human as they are, they will, like, freak out and think it's some, like, demented alien. An obvious example there is a man like H.P. Lovecraft, or for a less meme example, E.R. Edison is the one I raise, another figure who was very influential in shaping modern pop culture. Or for another example, Jack Vance, the kind of Navy merchant man from World War II who wrote these kind of violent, picaresque fantasy adventures. All three of these men were massive influences upon the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, which is a very important pop cultural touchstone now, which is, if anything, more popular today than ever. But again, cultural clear cut, just because you're kind of looking at it doesn't mean you appreciate it. And like H.P. Lovecraft is technically more popular than ever, but I would say the number of people who can really reach the man's soul and sympathize with him has probably remained about static from the time he was alive to now. He's kind of a naturally lonely and distant figure, even at the best of times. And maybe it's better now he's kind of become a universal hero for a certain kind of man who is always a minority. Lovecraft is known to all of the Lovecrafts of our own time, I would say.
He's known to Welbeck. Welbeck, I think, understands him, but
Yes.
most of
Welbeck, who is again like a Lovecraft of our time, another like
yeah.
natural, like weird, brooding male outcast, which is again like people read Welbeck, but how many people can understand him? I don't know. The sales figures may not reflect that too well. But then it's a very miserable age. Maybe Lovecraft would have more friends if he were alive today, which is kind of a miserable thought.
Maybe, maybe. I mean, with not understanding it, I think a lot of it is a or not a lot of it, but obviously a component of it is political pragmatism and this fear of decoding something that's right in front of you if it ends up
Yes,
being
that's
sort
kind
of
of
naughty.
other than examples of the thing that gets into the nature of it. Like, what was the political clear cut? It wasn't just like a forgetting, like, oh, well, the corpos invented TV and everyone stopped reading books. No, it's more like they created TV, which allowed them to leverage more strongly the idea of programming. And what happened was basically they were able to start social engineering. And yes, culture terror suggests like a deliberate social engineering program, which is how we can put what happened. It might sound absurd, but if you think of events in the last 10 years suggesting that, like, to talk about video games, we need to talk about social engineering. Well, if you know what's going on with video games and the internet, you know. We can explain briefly later if you'd like, but that should not be an absurd proposition to anybody who's even remotely informed.
Yes, I think all of our listeners have probably heard of what was it, Sweet Baby Inc. But
Yes, but even
I think
before that,
it's
just the
yeah, before
essential
that.
conflict of Gamergate. It's basically video games were kind of ground zero for the reignition of like explicit hard cultural engineering in the 21st century. Maybe it was because it's a kind of juvenile, nascent industry. It was seen as an easy target for a test run by very sinister world manipulating powers. The smoking man from the X Files is sitting back saying, we're deploying the new techniques, start with the gamers. I don't know, maybe that's going on, or maybe it was just complete chance. These people were just kind of faithfully carrying out the programming, which, again, back to what I was saying, this did not start 10 years ago with Anita Sarkeesian saying that Bayonetta is sexist. This goes back to, again, the clear cut, as I said, the first part of the culture terror. Where do we kind of break with the history that came before us? It's a two-part process, you might say. First, there is a kind of break in continuity, and then there is a break in people capable of understanding it. And Dungeons and Dragons was, even if it didn't have as edges as severe as the works of a Vance or an Edison or a Lovecraft, or even more extreme, maybe if we go further back, it was written by some relatively hard-bitten men, like our friend Graveler on the forum said recently, like a lot of these guys who made Dungeons and Dragons, they survived the Vietnam War. They may not have been there willingly. These were men who, like Shakespeare, they had some hard contact with hard times, and that had to, create a natural affinity between them and these men of culture from the past who were, to a large extent, shaped by hard experiences that they couldn't necessarily avoid. The harder world, just not saying that it like makes you a coarse person, it makes you a more worldly person, I want to say, because I do believe that what these people share and are able to connect with is what is frankly like correct and rich and true to the human experience within them. People today are not naive, they are basically like sheltered and engineered, which is a very different thing. So where is the cutoff point? You kind of it's somewhere between kind of World War II and 68, the two kind of great reshaping points of the 20th century. There was a kind of progressive kind of forgetting, you could say, like stories start to, like the ideas of the kind of backward looking reactionary men who wrote the like hard bones of 20th century genre fiction, that kind of went out of vogue. This idea of being a Robert E. Howard kind of strongman fantasizer kind of gave way to, kind of more playful and experimental fiction on one level with men like Vance, but also kind of just a drifting away from such harsh themes in general. By the time of Dungeons and Dragons, we aren't. Again, it's a very interesting thing. It's kind of like what happened with visual novels, where like people think they're being clever when they're being meta, when like, no, generally innovations in form come with like the philosophical, like most complex things you can do there, because that was actually necessary to make the jump. That's a point I've made in relation to Far Cry 2, that it basically says everything you can about making an open world game, because like the reason it is such an elaborate open world game was to say these things. And people think like they might be being clever now, like, oh, what if I did like a meta thing where like Conan the Barbarian has an existential crisis? Like, read literally the first Conan the Barbarian story, the dragon on the sword, and that is basically what is happening. Conan, a lot of people probably don't know this. In the first story, his time as an adventurer is over, and he is kind of sadly reflecting and looking back and kind of challenged and disappointed by life around him. Conan is an inherently existential figure and always was all along, and people say like, oh, it's this kind of like stupid macho fantasy, and I'm going to like play off of that. Like, no, these guys had your number from the start. So what happened was, instead, like the reason they got that idea, it's because, it's the same reason that people think Evangelion is a deconstruction of Mecha, when Armorer in Mobile Suit Gundam also did not want to get into the robot for a while. The things that happen over time, generally there's a kind of philosophic jump which makes a new innovation in storytelling possible, a genre development or so on. And that kind of, the philosophical jump starting is there right at the beginning in a complete form, like Conan the Barbarian, this existential manly hero, existentially challenged. And then it bleeds off from there and becomes kind of like, guys who understand that, but they're thinking like, okay, it's done, so I'm going to get more frivolous and formal with it, like Jack Vance kind of taking the idea of weird fiction to kind of absurd novel and comedic lengths in his Dying Earth stories. And then Dungeons and Dragons is kind of another step downstream from there. Like, they have been reading guys like Vance directly, and these are still hard men who have had real contact with the world and worldly character shaping experiences. They're serious people, but maybe they haven't read all of the classics, and maybe they would consider a guy like Howard or Lovecraft a bit extreme in their character. Like, hey, lighten up, bro, the world's just getting better. And then by like the 90s, things are real bad, and it's a kind of progressive bleeding out. So I don't want to identify a point. We didn't live in the Soviet Union, frankly, all of us in the English speaking world. There was no point where some apparatchik said, like, stories about manliness are illegal, dunk. It was instead this process I described of basically dilution and a lack of like philosophic impetus caused by like basically again the bleeding off of energy everywhere all at once, alongside a few basically within publishing and such. There was kind of a soft purge which has been written about by some people, where basically right wingers fell out of favor, which means, men who are more worldly in their leanings and inclinations. Like in England, a lot of the kind of like angry young men novels kind of sounds like something people say on the internet now. If you know, you know, we'll leave that be. I kind of I'm sick of it. Those guys had a lot of trouble getting published. I think it was a friend of Jonathan Bowden, one of them, who wrote like the last novel since Lady Chatterley's Lover to be banned in England, which is kind of insane. Like, there was a bit, frankly, well, not the Soviet Union, but there was a bit of like, nope, we're done with that. And that did kind of bleed a lot of potential new energy out of culture. And at the same time, there was just this kind of relaxation as people kind of had increasingly more amounts of just like fun and kind of like frivolous fun, specifically with the things that they had inherited over time. And that led to a bleeding off. And this Vietnam generation who made Dungeons and Dragons, they're still human, but those guys are getting like canceled now by the people of today. You want to say that, like, yeah, it was kind of a healthy continuity, and even in the 90s we had this kind of resurgence, this thaw moment, what I call the 90s dark libertarians, which is the cultural milieu to which I attribute the genesis of works like Halo Combat Evolved and Marathon and Myth before it, novels like The Black Company, which were a bit earlier. And also, if you want to get more broadly into online culture, I believe that this is where Mencius Moldbug kind of cut his teeth.
Oh yeah.
This was really like the world of letters. Like, a big deal why I'm able to consider my work seriously is that, like, what is the modern world of letters? Like, a gajillion, like 100 years ago, it was a bunch of like poor, angry men, Ezra Pound and his buddies, sending letters to each other. What is the modern equivalent of that? It's not what's going on in university departments. It's basically us, me and you, we're like characters in the extended Ezra Pound verse, sending letters
Absolutely.
back and forth, only with telecommunications. Like, those guys were poor as hell in their own time, but like, it was them and their buddies who were doing things like saying, hey, this old forgotten novel is pretty good. I'm sending you a copy. It's called Moby Dick. Their judgments kind of lasted. So, like, yeah, back in that time, being the one guy who thinks Moby Dick was good might have looked absurd. And, now I'm that one guy for Halo. Who knows? Maybe they'll force you to play Halo in a school one day.
Let's hope so.
But
Uh,
yes, that's
yeah,
this idea of the clear cut. It's maybe not necessarily a clear cut as like a poisoning and a lack of nutrients leading to a die off. Do you understand when I just say that, like, this vital energy that created the new things on one hand was dying off, and this increasing distance from the kind of worldly rich character, very broadly experienced, deeply rooted men of culture, the distance we get from them, like, our men of culture and letters become diluted and reduced figures throughout the 20th century. And, each generation we're downstream. And if we think of ourselves, we're like, the great titans of popular culture 100 years ago, these men who had their roots in the classics and very rich compared to us, and ability to just experience the world around them in a visceral way. And that gets fainter and fainter for a few generations, and we are like several steps downstream from that. And you and I, we're men who actively seek to cultivate ourselves, and most people are not. So the first half of this, the cultural kind of die off, the spiritual kind of clear cut, have I made it clear how we kind of got here, and why when speaking to people you have to kind of take for granted and catch them up a bit that they just do not have the kind of cultural grounding needed to appreciate a lot of rich works with a lot going on that used to be something that everyone had, or at least it was
ab
far more common.
absolutely. We have to start over from first principles now because there's been this die-off you've been talking about. There's been this stupefaction,
Yes,
culture-wide.
it
And
wasn't entirely a kind of like, and yes, it wasn't, I say culture terror, but it's kind of the velvet glove on top of the iron gauntlet. It wasn't like they didn't just smash us down. It was kind of a bit now and then of like, no, this book can't be published. We're going to kind of like give bad reviews to this guy and keep him out of the spotlight and promote something that we prefer would succeed. But, there was no like great smashing. It was just kind of unhealthy incentives have accrued in effects for decades as well.
it's usually not as clear as something like
Incentives, I meant to
the
say, not
yeah,
effects.
it's usually not something as obvious as the $1 million extreme Adult Swim cancellation.
Yes.
It's editors, it's sensitivity readers, it's the side eye sort of
Yes,
thing.
and that's
It's
been
very subtle.
developing for a long time. Like there was no like insane human resources department just like vetoing 99% of what men produce that gets put in front of them back in like the 60s, but there was like the earliest predecessors of the spirit of what that is. Like their great spiritual great grandparents were in the room and they were, as our force got weaker, theirs got stronger. Like it was a weak, kind of controlling, repressing force, which is now at like a shrill fever pitch, which has gone full circle and kind of ruined its power because there is no subtlety left and people just step around it because they have no respect for it.
Yes, the momentum is on our side now. Maybe that's a little too optimistic, but that's the sense that I think a lot of people are getting.
I'm feeling rather good, but that's rather complex to get into. I'll
Yeah.
for the poor audience trying to follow us like point by
Yeah.
point, we're weaving
We
them
won't get
quite
into that. Yeah.
we're weaving them quite hard.
Yeah.
If the first half of the culture terror was this kind of like slow poisoning and strangulation of what is like vital and good and true and what resonates and is richly informed and worldly in the culture and the arts and the humanities in general, that is kind of an extended point to make that basically all fields of genuine intellectual life and curiosity have undergone the same fate and are equally weakened and enfeebled now and kind of run by absurd people who have kind of given the whole game away and blown it for themselves at this point. Like, I'm basically talking about academia. There's no life left there.
Oh yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
yes, alongside that, more specifically, now I'm sure this will be a great relief to the listeners by back on topic. Specifically in the critical context, when I'm talking about like how to make sense of a thing, how to understand what I'm saying about the latest meme video game being talked about on Twitter, there was a clear cut. That's one half of the culture terror. The other half is the artificial construction placed on top. It's not enough to acknowledge and like show people how like culturally deprived they are. I have to tear down what they think is supporting them and like explain what's going on as I'm swinging my sledgehammer to explain why this is necessary and good for you and everything you've been taught is a tool to help you understand art is actually just like something between either like a lie or just a kind of poorly informed guess that was wrong or just like an idiot trying to rip you off. It's all bad and it's all got to go. The artificial instruction, and we raised a few kind of essential case studies there we could get into, but specifically as the kind of archetypal issue that happened, it's very much true of video games, but we can expand the example out a bit. This kind of particular pet issue of mine, I think you'll agree, is you'll understand where I'm going, is the kind of creation of retroactively created and kind of retroactively applied rules for construction of a work which are impersonal and the idea is kind of if followed will create a superior work, kind of looking at things an artist made and pretending it was kind of made from a void in accordance with like trying to be a realization of certain laws and grading it in accordance with those laws. Do you see where I'm going with that? We can get onto a
Absolutely.
key example.
Absolutely. For example, the retroactive creation of the in sim genre.
Yes. More specifically, I think I'm going to talk about the famous example to kind of broaden it out onto a cultural
Yes.
level to explain this is bigger than video games. The
Yes.
example I think we may have discussed a bit earlier is Mike Stocklas's review for Red Letter Media of George Lucas's Star Wars prequels, where
Yes, let's
he
get
was a
into
man
that.
who had a visceral emotional reaction to movies that he did not like. And he kind of explored his head and realized that he was a Gen Xer, I believe, to tell you like how far along in the cultural poisoning process he was. He did not possess good conceptual tools to criticize this film that upset him, but he had a bad feeling about it, which may have been more a reflection of his own personal hang-ups and perhaps immaturity as an audience member, but he did not, you know, assess his reaction that way. He believed that the movie had done something wrong, and what he made was a very successful YouTube project called the Mr. Plinkett Review of the Star Wars prequels. And what he did was putting on this character of a kind of irascible, grumpy man, talked about how objectively we've basically broken down the cinema science, the film science, the movie science. I can break it down to a level of rules which George Lucas failed to obey of how to make a good movie and why The Phantom Menace is not a good movie because it fails to obey these good movie rules. Yes, do you think that's a fair assessment of what that man's project was?
Yes, absolutely. It is trying to superimpose almost mathematical rules of
Yes.
good
And
narrative.
maybe there is something to be said for elements of that. Like some things may work better, like rules of thirds for framing images and so on. But even then, these things should be thought of as tools and in the hands of a master familiar with convention, craft, and tradition. They can be broken for effect quite easily and often. But what really happened, interestingly, with Mike Stoklasa is his kind of rules got put to the test. He got exactly what he wished for. The monkey paw curled when he made these videos. At some point, he made a very specific claim. He said, "You know who should direct a Star Wars sequel? J.J. Abrams." And of course, J.J. Abrams made the most like conventional by the book trilogy of Star Wars films, just completely like if George Lucas just followed his heart and did what he thought would be entertaining, and Mike Stoklasa said like, no, it's not conventional enough. It's not the film I expected you to make. It's not like all of the other movies that I found broadly acceptable and inoffensive. J.J. Abrams made the most soulless, inoffensive, impersonal, by the book films ever. And Mike Stoklasa was just really just floored by this. I don't know if he ever spiritually recovered. He opened his review of the last one, The Last Skywalker, or whatever it was called. He literally said to the audience, I want to open by saying, this wasn't my fault. Are you sure about that, Mr. Stoklasa? Yes, but
And one of the ironies of that original review is that I think it's actually fallen victim to the larger tendency it's a part of, where now the main response people will have to that review is that they find the narrative framework around it distasteful because it's all of these jokes about killing prostitutes
yes, the
and
Mr.
stuff like
Plinkett
that.
character is very vulgar. It's a very like
Yes.
stupid 2000s Gen X kind of
Yeah.
humor, which is very dated, whereas like George Lucas's humor, everyone hated Jar Jar. I don't think anyone does now. He was tapping into something timeless while because again, he is a man with, even though he was like a hippie who protested Vietnam, he was like a, still by virtue of being born earlier in the die-off, he had far deeper and richer cultural roots. He was ultimately a more encultured and serious and worldly man than Mike Stoklasa. He has a better grip on what is good for the human soul. And to tie it back around to the theme of video games and kind of bad creative infrastructure, the whole, it became a big thing in the 2000s, kind of starting as a joke and then got serious. That's a whole other thing, which I could get into. But it became kind of the how to talk about a video game online in as an intelligent person way to, again, basically become your own Mr. Plinkett. Look at the games you like, declare them to be products of rules that the creators never mentioned. The creators aren't even in your mind beyond like saying, hey, Shigeru Miyamoto's an asshole or whatever. But like, no, you just say like, okay, we're doing the video game science, and you know it's science because we have rules and technicalities. And that's still largely a thing today. People will just try to like rules lawyer their way into the conclusions they want, or alternatively, the tail wags the dog, and people just kind of like try to force their taste to conform with things which can be quantified. Like on paper, it is easier to make it an argument that certain games are better than other games. So, in kind of aspirationally serious, deep appreciative, hardcore gamer culture, certain titles became prestigious just because frankly, it was easier to make rules for why, plausible sounding rules for why they should be prestigious. The main product of this, I believe, was the very long standing, largely still there, neuroses in video game criticism over gameplay, and it's very much a fan thing as well. Perhaps critics are a bit embarrassed about that. In their guts, even if they're mostly fools, they know that this just doesn't pass the smell test. But this idea of like, okay, we're making video games. Perhaps we should say that the more game it is, the better it is because you are making a less pure game if you do less game. You waste my time with cutscenes or whatever. But it kind of brings to mind the drunk who's looking for his dropped keys under the streetlight. Hey, buddy, why are you looking there? I dropped my keys. Did you drop them under that light? No, but this is where the light is. Just like, why are you just like, why are you critiquing all the gameplay with this much effort? It's the only thing I can try to like fit into a formula, and I feel like criticism should take the form of a formula. And if I try to like critique drama, things get like mystical and scary, and I'm afraid of that. So we're going to stay in the zone of where there's light, and I feel comfortable, like I could find something, which means I'm going to try to reduce what is, in actuality, a kind of multimedia art piece to a kind of mathematical equation, a kind of Sudoku puzzle, but more complex. And I can classify it better or worse based on, simple principles of construction.
Yes, this is a fairly basic insight that I think a lot of people miss. Gameplay is not unique to video games. Sports
Uh,
have gameplay. Uh,
I would
I would
say
say,
I would say as works of like artifice and the idea of like making something expressive, I would say they are unique. Like, I don't know, maybe Icy Calm would go into that. I don't want to mention him
yes.
and misrepresent his reviews. He will attack me on Twitter if I do that. He's a funny guy. He's found my 4chan post somehow before.
Oh boy.
Yeah, he was all right. He was
Yes.
wrong, so he didn't upset me when he answered me. But anyway,
Yes.
we were
Well,
saying
yeah. How would you put this exactly? Because
I would
maybe
say
I'm
game
oversimplifying it.
uniquely, I would say gameplay is a unique element to video games. It is a tool in the box which you do not have if you are making a film or writing a novel. And, you say like sports are games, but they are not games as an expressive element of a greater vision where
Yes.
I, I've said before, like, I define game within video games as the element which is a kind of contrived challenge. A game, even as sports, we can define a consistent definition across video games and sports as a contrived challenge which we agree to respect and take seriously for whatever reason. And what you can do when making a video game is, as an artist, you can basically present a game, a contrived challenge to your audience members which they will respect and take seriously because they believe in your vision and the idea that it will become more interesting or engrossing. And a bit of a tangent, but this leads into a meta theme of a visual novel, which ostensibly has no gameplay, but actually does in a meta sense if you think about it. I said kind of literature doesn't have games, but actually it kind of does, especially a certain genre. Detective fiction, in a sense, has gameplay in the sense that it contains a contrived challenge which you agree to respect. You do not flip to the end of a detective story to find out who the killer is. You agree to go through it at the pace of unfolding decided by the creator, and you work things out at the pace they decide you should be allowed to be given new clues. It's all a game played between you and them in the same sense that a video game is, because they are constructing the puzzle and they can give you the tools to overcome it. The same is true of someone creating a mystery novel, and I almost said visual novel there because, the video game that's not a video game, which really brings this to the forefront, is Ryukishi '07's visual novel Umineko. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh, of course, the Gothic girl. I've seen many representations of it, but I've never actually played it.
Oh, well, the whole thing is that it was basically a giant meta game, despite being basically a series of stories, mostly based in text, which were released over a long time with lots of encouragement for people to come together and try to figure out what was happening as each episode was released like once a year, one at a time, and we got closer to the conclusion. It was a very engrossing thing. So that is a very long way of saying that gameplay is perhaps not exclusively the domain of video games. That's just a pleasing thought which came to me now. This is a very stimulating discussion. I'm happy we're having it. We're all
Yes,
growing here and learning.
yes.
Now, I'm sorry, audience, if I am like desperately straining this weave. We will get back to the point now. Yes, bad creative, no, bad critical infrastructure. Yes, that is kind of the central rule. This idea of just placing importance upon a kind of central mistake was placing importance upon arbitrarily selected elements just to create something that felt like a theory by people who basically had nothing to say but wanted to say something. And, rather than looking at the history of art criticism for help, they just kind of, they looked for things that looked like they could be quantified and declared those to be the most important, rather like the drunk who decided he would look where the light is. Just because you can make a rule of this does not mean there is actually a rule there. And yes, of course, nobody has ever actually really, by following any coherent. For one, these sets of gameplay rules have never been formalized into one set. There is your obvious sign that this is kind of sophistry and mistakes and intellectual dead ends. And of course, because there is no one master set, nobody can put this to the test and construct something according to these rules, which should, if those rules are correct, lead to something more perfect. Instead, people who kind of get stuck up on that just kind of make awkward clones of things that exist, which are devoid of the actual animating substance, which is, again, as I was saying, even in the case of very mechanical works, which are primarily enjoyed on that level, often underlying it, there is this kind of groundedness in culture and human experience, which is lacking, which even if you try to just technically clone something that exists and mostly was appreciated as a technical toy, you'll often just somehow like miss something that would have occurred to you if you were a more worldly person. That's kind of the secret ingredient of being a good artist of any kind, even a kind of technician and craftsman and toy maker on the more less expressive and meaningful and more just like genuinely existing to have fun with level of making video games. I believe that enculturation is an essential factor. Like, I don't really believe that anyone would disagree with me if I were to say that Nintendo tries to actually put cultivated people in charge who have a kind of novel and richly informed way of looking at the world, which brings a kind of spark to what are, at their base, like fundamentally just meant to be toys. Like the unique character of a thing which could be very simple, like not just in terms of set dressing and incidental detail, but you need a kind of like skew informed by reality to kind of just, again, the philosophical jump. Like even if you're a toy maker, you need a kind of like spurring novel notion, which you probably won't have if you just kind of like live inside a world of theory, which may sound cliche, but I believe that if that is a cliche, that it is at least somewhat rooted in truth.
Yes, I mean, let's get into these derivations of misapplied ad hoc rules that were like hallucinated from faulty
Well,
first principles. Let's get into the video essayists, in
well,
other words.
I'll say though briefly, like I was saying, like
Yes,
I write reviews on this backlog site and I
yes,
go all the way around, like through the clear cut and through the thing. Like what I am doing is basically I have to explain that the way you look at something is wrong before I explain what we're actually looking at. And
yes.
yes, if you want to go into like a few particular case studies, then yes, there are people who have like we can look at people who have their own particular infrastructure or are just faithful to a particular way of doing things they've received and they're wrong. It's just the whole cultural landscape, to go back to where we started, I was not satisfied with it, which was why I had to take action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I think that the existing critical content on YouTube for video essays, this actually just came to me. It's using this very auto-fictional framework a lot of the
Yes,
time.
yes, yes.
We get into the two key figures here, I'd say, are Tim Rogers and Jacob Gellers, and with both of them, you have these ad hoc rules that are being applied to everything, but you also have this certain kind of autobiographical emotional manipulation going on, where there is an
Yes.
emotional through line that feels very sort of uncanny.
Yes, to not get to the level of just like attacking these people. If we talk
Yes.
about them as critics, what's going on here in each case is basically like junk theory, which is just kind of a hook to get you in, like, ooh, let's get like the look how long this video's runtime is. I must be like really important and have a lot to say. I must be smarter than you. You should be like anxious and deferential to me. And then you go in and it's just this kind of succession of kind of hooks, memes, stumbling around under the light looking for your keys and kind of like weird, like baity psychological tricks, almost frankly. Like a lot of what they do is comparable to like Eckhart Tolle and something between like Eckhart Tolle and Mr. Beast, where they're basically trying to hypnotize you for engagement, which is, again, kind of the quality of my own work where I believe it's like contributing to the world of letters just a bit more through video, where like, no, I believe that actually reaching people in the sense of like not just getting their eyes on my content, but like actually reaching out to another mind is important. Whereas like Jacob Geller and Tim Rogers want to actually like obliterate your consciousness while your computer is connected to their video just so they get like another number and better like analytics. They are kind of insane like that, where, you know, they don't need or want you as a person. They need you as basically a consumer of their product. And what they do is they basically hook you in with the promise of criticism, because I think it is unfortunately a kind of tragedy of our time that a lot of people do want to know more and they're kind of chronically anxious. It's this kind of imposter syndrome crisis where like everyone, even if their things do mean a lot to them, they don't know how to articulate it and they're like insecure, they're doing it wrong. It's a very powerful hook to say like, don't worry, child, I have the answers. And then once they're in, you just kind of, yeah, you just break out the trick book and you start speaking hypnotically. You apply all of these like weird like TV advertising bagman tricks to like psychologically enslave people. And it's, you know, once you're clicked on, you aren't like, even though they might dress it up like that, you aren't like connecting with this beautiful soul who is pouring his heart out to you about what a work of art meant. No, that's just kind of the superficially that's what's happening, but you're being seduced, you're being played. Think about what's going on. Like after you watch one of these videos, maybe you can like repeat a few half remembered key phrases, but if I really kind of put your feet to the fire, will you be able to survive a round of follow-up questioning from me, or will I have you in tears after a few moments? Like that's what I hope with my own videos, that like if you watch the whole Anthony plays Halo thing, like ideally I have like lifted the veil from your eyes. Like if you get asked about like, oh well, how do I enrich my understanding of a video game, you should like, ideally if you've been listening and actually like listening, I have reached you, you can give a much more articulate and thoughtful answer than you could before, because you actually, thanks to like listening and I've prompted the right thoughts in you, I want you to go through the development I did without having to kind of scrap it together yourself. Like
Yes,
ideally, you
it's
know more.
pedagogy, it's pedagogy versus edutainment,
Yes,
essentially.
basically, like,
Yes.
no, like, I don't just want you as like a figure to bolster my view count to make me feel like a big man and get me like another 1 cent of ad money. I don't even have ads. We can get to that later if I ever get good enough, but no,
Hopefully.
what's going on is
Yeah.
just, no, I'm trying to reach you, and Jacob Geller and Tim Rogers, it's kind of obscene that they, again, it's seduction, it's manipulation. They act like they're trying to reach you, like both emotionally as well as intellectually. And actually, they're doing neither, I believe. Like, again, the emotional thing, like, if you just want to, like, if you find someone interesting, that's fine. And as I said at some point in the Halo video, I think in the ninth level, that ultimately, what does it mean to, like, appreciate Halo? Do I just get a kind of intellectual satisfaction out of, like, recognizing will behind something? Yes, but also it's a means of, you know, reaching people. It makes me happy to like feel closer to other people, to appreciate their passion and recognize what was important to them and the fact that they, and you know, the brilliance of their artifice, that they were able to, you know, make, they were able to channel their passions and their interests, you know, this is who they are worked into something that stands beyond them. That's very interesting. And you know, I am interested in people in general. And if, and you know, if Tim Rogers was just kind of doing what the creators of Halo were doing, he is just kind of refracting his soul into this finished form, concentrating it into this finished video that exists beyond him, and I can look at that and feel closer to another person. That's fine, but that's not the impression I get watching him. It's not the impression I get watching Jacob Geller. It's like I am just watching a guy lie to me out of both sides of his mouth at the same time. Like, what do you think I am? This is obscene.
And now that we've gone through the effect that this culture terror has had on criticism,
Hmm.
let's get into video game art in the wake of culture terror. And I think that we've discussed before this episode started recording some really interesting
Yes.
case
I will just say
studies.
briefly, like you said,
Yes.
after culture terror, like video games as a whole, like took place, they were born in the kind of barren, relatively barren cultural landscape of the late 20th century, I'll say. But again, it's that kind of spurring impetus was there. It was such a kind of novel field, and it was a kind of somewhat relaxed point, and also just relaxed because it was a new form, like the infrastructure to kind of suppress naughtiness had not emerged yet. It was a
Hmm.
very relatively free time, but then there was a kind of like there was a point where it was living under video games were made under passive cultural terror, just the kind of like cultural water we're all in, where like the richness of the human past is kind of like suppressed and diluted to the point where it's kind of drowned out by the noise around us. And then after a certain point, it gets active, and like video games start undergoing the same killing process. Like ideas get vetoed, people get thrown out, and so certain works are promoted and others sidelined, and so on.
Yeah, I'd say one of the really interesting hinge points for this uh, for where we were at as a culture within the last few years is Disco Elysium.
Yes, if you want to talk about games like that really stand for cultural moments, we talked about a few, but one that really like is a cultural moment in my mind, just a fun one we can talk about to just throw around as a case study to just talk about making sense of things here. Disco Elysium, very entertaining piece of work in its own way. I thought it was fine to play through just once as it was, but then beyond that, kind of thinking about it is deeply entertaining to me because as a game, it is the first Trump term game. Nothing else will kind of capture what was happening culturally in that moment more than this particular work. And I believe I put this down in writing somewhere before. It's not that complicated. I don't have to think about it now, but that was the 2016 internet politic 2016 to 20 internet politics game particularly. And what was happening was after years of the kind of rightward domination of the internet in general, there was a kind of like loss of energy in response to real life things that happened there and disappointment with the frustration of Trump's first term. And the left elements online kind of like rallied and reorganized around a few new aesthetic and just kind of like idealistic idealistic premises on which there was a kind of not a harmonizing, but a kind of like reaching across the aisle moment culturally, where it was kind of like, okay, the right are getting a bit kind of like mystical and less like hard minded. Here are things we're going to do to fix the world. And there's kind of this low energy, kind of helplessness, victimized mindset of like, okay, we can kind of all agree. We just feel like the world is sort of overwhelming us lately, and we can kind of unite as kind of like cool thinking people who are left a bit kind of out of sorts. We're all bewildered and helpless by this kind of like great chaotic mess the world has devolved into. It's very alienating, it's very sad, it's very tragic, and we can all agree on this. Let's reach across the aisle, like angry guys who maybe have illegal thoughts on World War II and like leftist people who are like, we've just accepted that problems of government are intractable and we're all kind of like screwed in the big picture. So let's just have this big existential coming together moment of like, helplessness, hug boxing, mysticism. And that whole cultural moment, I believe, for as long as it lasted, it lasts forever in Disco Elysium, I think. And then, of course, thankfully, it broke up in real life.
It was the last moment where there could be this sense of some kind of treaty
Yes,
being
I think I
written.
called it a kind of in writing, I called it a swan song of kind of cool leftism's integrity. And I believe we mentioned this the last time it came up, the number of like left internet figures who were on this game and how like there was no more like rapprochement. You can hang out with the cooler, edgier people after this. People had to pick sides. Would you like to elaborate there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Dasha was still on the left, and
Yes,
she was a voice actor in the game. You had
the Red Scare
references, yeah,
woman, yes.
the Red Scare woman. You had Nick Mullen being referenced. You had Matt Crispin from Chapo Trap House, but at the same time, you had uh, a character who's basically a Bronze Age pervert as a hotep. You had this kind of broad engagement with
Yes.
weird internet culture, I think is what they would call it.
The idea was
And
like, yeah, it's a kind of big ship that we're all in. Like, we're all just these kind of like equally helpless and equally absurd, quirked out bodega punk people who just need to kind of lo fi chill in the moment and embrace the mystery and impossibility of resolving anything. That was the moment of Disco Elysium, but unfortunately for them, afterwards we had to pick sides. And of course, like you mentioned, Dasha, and she thought, like, okay, this whole like left weird cool movement is a sinking ship. I'm gonna go hang out with Mencius Moldbug. And maybe a few other people kind of like drifted one way or another. Frankly, I don't track these people. But it seems like it went that way, and like the company went bust, which is kind of sad, but also just kind of like perfectly fitting for what like, yeah, like you guys were like a moment in time. You got one workout which was of that time, and things would have been rough for you going forward. You had to pick a side.
it's sort of the perfect ending to that studio because it's exactly the sensibility of that world they created too. That it was this
Yes.
like beautifully doomed thing that never could have lasted.
Yes, that was the way to do it, basically. The ones who got out with dignity were the ones who thought, like, it's a beautiful dream and it's doomed. And now, like, okay, the best way you can swing this is, like, I've become more worldly now and just try to, like, yeah, start reading Moldbug. That's the best you can do for your reputation. That or just stop doing anything. If you keep trying to, like, preach the left side and say, like, we're all equally silly, like, no, culture kind of left you guys behind. You were rejected at the ballot box, I'm afraid.
Yes, do you see any signs of cultural thaw at all with any
I
of this?
see
I see some,
plenty.
yeah,
I see
yeah.
plenty for better and worse. I think that there is a kind of Lobian Thor coming. For those who don't know, by that we mean a kind of like a crass, kind of like low minded, like not really getting it, but right aligned, like, how do I put this for in the simplest terms possible? Like a rightward turn on the level of like Joe Rogan, perhaps. Like things are just going to like
Yes.
simple people who are like scared of weird, crazy shit going wrong, as they should be. But like their picture of the world isn't too simple. It's just like, okay, we're going to turn off the weirdness tap and go back to like 2012. Like again, they don't have my like conceptual framing where like no, we're like 50, 60, 70 years long into a process of like our culture being poisoned and enfeebled. Like they only noticed something going wrong when like I don't know, Barack Obama was first on stage with a drag queen or something, and they thought like,
Hmm.
wow, did things get weird in America lately? Just like I want to go back to Call of Duty 7. I want to go back to The Last of Us. I want to go back to Uncharted 3. I want to go back to Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. There's your cultural thaw. Like these people have not heard of E.R. Edison. Their idea of going back is just like, can we go back to how like terminally ill I was a week ago rather than
Yeah,
now? Like that's not really how this works. You can't
yeah.
just like take a step backwards on this process of like crippling enfeeblement, which is a creeping phenomena which has been going for again decades and decades. And like again, it's largely built on the kind of bad critical infrastructure. Like I sometimes find smaller kind of like angry men of aspiring men of culture on YouTube who are like in these modes and try to answer them because they a lot of them are as well like the people who think things might be getting better now. That's because they're on like the bad cultural infrastructure. They don't really know what good things come from. They think like, yeah, video game studios are getting bullied into reprioritizing gameplay. That's progress. No, not really. Like they either like put artists in charge and have like these really like richly informed people working to deeper sensibilities, or we're just going to get like slightly less absurd junk. And frankly, that is what a lot of people want because again, like the kid in the museum, he just wants weapons to be in the paintings again. That's good for him, but ultimately there's a kind of the same rot between the simplified thing he likes and the really bad, eventually downstream thing that he doesn't like. Whereas the thing I like, he could like too, and that's the healthiest place for culture to be. And to kind of bring it around to a central idea of understanding gaming, all of these forces I'm talking about largely don't apply to Japan. And basically, every Japanese work, the standard there is that artists are in charge rather than like programmers who are like completely like deracinated and cut off from culture and history. And so they tend to get far richer works. And most famous Japanese video games, they're like, it's like going to the museum to look at the Night Watch. If you have eyes to see, there is a lot more going on. Like, even if you just appreciate it as a technical piece, like the level of like mastery expressed within its realization of the simple premise is incredible, but these are really much richer works in most cases than they get credit for. And if we let like an ignorant kind of culturally uprooted American try to clone this industry, the results never go well. And we have many case studies of Japanese IPs being outsourced to America or Canada, and the thing just kind of explodes upon the first try because, yes, those roots, which are kind of the rest of the iceberg under the creative iceberg under the water, you only see the kind of product of those roots in the finished work. If you don't have the eyes to see, again, that is what most people are seeing, but the rest is there.
Yes, there's been a few interesting instances of works that aren't actually interesting in and of themselves, but they have these sort of like warehouse core reactionary signifiers. I'm thinking a lot about this video game Stellar Blade. Have you heard of this? It's
There are some things we could say about Stellar Blade, the
yeah, not Japan.
autogynephilia
That's yeah.
person action
Yeah.
game.
Final thoughts on the video game science and how it applies to uh like the future of video games and where we're going as a culture.
Final thoughts on the video game science are that I'm going to keep it marching onward, and the idea is that I'm building up across multiple places, and morale kind of goes up and down, but more work is behind me every day. And, I do actually it gets my blood up, and I'm very excited. And you say, like, the thaw, in a sense, is potentially coming around now. Like, the time is ripe for it. It is time to I feel like if I reach out, there are more minds to be reached at the moment. It's kind of like ending to the first Matrix movie or something. There are red pills out everywhere. I'm ready to kind of fly out of the phone booth and just start grabbing people up and enlightening them all over the place. Like, I feel
Beautiful.
like we're exponentially reaching more people and having better results and more work finished work that I can point to and say, like, go there, learn, is accruing all the time. And that is a very good thing. And of course, here is like the great example. We're doing a podcast right now. That's where my like let's play with 100 viewers got to over the course of a year or so. This is progress.
Yes, absolutely. And if you want to learn more about video game science and just criticism in general, I implore you, listener, to click the link beneath this audio file and watch Anthony's series from beginning to end because it's some of the best criticism you'll see on YouTube, and to read his backlog, which is some of the best writing you can find on video games.
Thank you. And of course, I turn up here and there in other places. So if you find me in person somewhere, you can observe me or ask. And there is just a kind of history behind us, which is also less formal. And just,
Yes.
I'm sorry, you can cut that. Just to let me leave it off with just like, thank you very much. It means a lot to hear. And yes, I'm always trying to build up more of a presence online, more things for you to look at if you appreciate what I'm doing. Hopefully, the picture is just getting clearer and richer all the time. We are going to restore the video game science.